Hi, everyone. Welcome. So glad you've joined us today. This panel is our Pandemic, Protests and Profit, Surveillance Capitalism and the Role of Investors. My name is Hannah Lukel, and I'm Associate Director of Open Mic. I use she, her pronouns, and Open Mic is an organization. We're a nonprofit that organizes investor support for corporate accountability campaigns in the media and tech sector. And I'm really excited to introduce our two panelists today. So we have here Shankar Narayan, who is an advocate, an attorney, and a change maker for fair, accountable, and community-centric technology. Shankar is the co-principal of Mira, which aims to reimagine institutions and shift power in a world transformed by technology. And Shankar was previously with the ACLU of Washington, where he founded the Tech Fairness Coalition, which helped pass landmark technology laws and campaign for vendors to build tech in ethical and community-centric ways. We also have with us today Emma Pullman. Emma built and is now leading the Capital Stewardship Program at BCGEU, which is one of British Columbia's largest and fastest growing unions. Emma is pushing for stronger investments that protect workers and the planet. She's focused on the environment and governance and human rights issues. And before joining BCGEU, Emma was the lead campaign strategist at Some of Us, which is a corporate accountability watchdog, and she led the shareholder work there. It looks like folks are joining still. And as you do, we invite you to share in the chat where you're joining from and what made you join this panel today. We're so excited that you're here. All right, so as we kick off this panel, I'm just gonna briefly ground us in a little bit of history about how we got to this place where we are discussing surveillance capitalism. And just noting that while technology gets more complicated and more sophisticated and more advanced every single day, surveillance has always been used as a tool to reinforce and maintain racial capitalism in the United States. And so everything that we're discussing today is going to be connected to that. The US economy was founded on slavery, and during slavery you had business folks who were surveilling enslaved Black people to increase their wealth. You also had the first police forces, which were the slave patrols, who were using surveillance also to protect property at a time when human beings were considered property. And so today, when we talk about the role of companies, the private sector, and also state surveillance that disproportionately harms Black and brown communities and immigrant communities and reinforces racism and economic injustice, we can connect all of this conversation back to the 1600s and the 1700s and the founding of the economy in the United States, and the way that racial terror has always been a part of that, and surveillance has been a tool to maintain that. So while we jump in here, we're going to discuss how investors and advocates are working together and addressing the role that companies play today in enabling surveillance in ways that upholds racism and economic injustice. And so I'm going to start just by asking Shankar and Emma, if you could just share with us, how do you define surveillance capitalism? What does that mean to you? And what are some of the harms or impacts of surveillance capitalism today?
You can take it, or I can, Emma.
No, I'll let you kick it off.
Well, I would say in the simplest possible terms, what I would consider surveillance capitalism is where both public and private sector data collection and surveillance enable this widespread commodification of people's data, largely without the agency of the people whose data it is to control that data or the decisions it drives. And this largely amplifies existing structural inequity in society, right? And then just thinking about, I think a few things that are important to know about surveillance capitalism. I mean, one is that, as Hannah mentioned, it's not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for a long time, and it is a subset of these historically disproportionate impacts of technology, particularly on marginalized and vulnerable communities. A good historic example that I like to give is the use of, the tabulation machines, the Hollerith machines that were developed for the U.S. Census, by a private party, being used to round up Japanese Americans during the incarceration of those individuals, right? So this has really been going on for quite a long time. A second thing that I think is important to know is that it blurs the lines between public and private surveillance. So you often have these networks of private surveillance whose data may be made available to the public sector. So even in a jurisdiction like Seattle, for example, Amazon Ring is a network of cameras that are surveilling public places and where the data may be available to law enforcement, despite Seattle having passed this really strong surveillance ordinance locally. And I think the third important thing is that there's just a Wild West space here, right? The space is not subject to a lot of regulation, either on the front end in terms of how much agency we have over our data, or on the back end where that data is actually fueling these AI-based decision tools that make important decisions about virtually every aspect of our lives, from whether we get a job to how we're policed and how much time we get to spend with our disability caseworker, how our performance is evaluated at work, all kinds of things. So this is a really big and important space for us to engage with.
Thank you, Shankar. Emma, do you want to share a little bit about what that term surveillance capitalism means to you?
I mean, I think Shankar really kind of encapsulated a lot of it. And I don't know that there's too much to add. But I also think that for those for whom this term might be brand new, just thinking of some kind of contemporary examples might be useful. And we've seen the rise in a lot of these technologies that are supposed to kind of save the world. But to every one of these technologies, there's a shadow side. And I think that Shankar touched on a lot of this shadow side, but we're talking about products like products that are working and software that's working directly with law enforcement to police, particularly brown and black bodies. And when we're talking about products like Amazon Ring, we're talking about a product being used by Thomson Reuters called Clear to track, detain, and deport migrants. And it's kind of gone into every sector of the economy. So it's not just the tech space any longer. It's literally from farm fields to our offices, to our classrooms now. Google Education is in 50% of US classrooms right now. And there's a lawsuit right now in, I believe, New Mexico, and it's that Google is data mining children. And so this is really I'm so glad we're having this conversation, and I think that a lot of folks, including the regulation is years behind the risk analysis, and I think that there's a big role that investors can and need to play right now.
Great, thank you both. So it sounds like we have everything from concerns about Amazon Ring doorbells and the police partnerships. There have been reports from Newsweek about how Amazon Ring data has been used by police to surveil anti-racism and Black Lives Matter protesters. You've got reports, I think, just this week about how, in addition to what you shared, Emma, about what's going on in New Mexico, Google is reportedly one of the vendors that Customs and Border Protection is going to be using to build their virtual wall at the border. And so increasingly, we're seeing the visibility of the military, government agencies, social service agencies, immigration enforcement agencies, and big brand name tech companies that many investors are invested in. So I'd love to hear more from both of you about, we have sort of this very fast-paced panel here today where we're not going to dive deep into the role of companies involved in surveillance, and we're just going to sort of briefly touch on some of those examples, but would love to hear about the work that you both are doing in this area, both from advocacy and activism space, and also in the shareholder advocacy and organizing space for you, Emma. So what, from the work that you're doing, what are some of the opportunities that you find to hold companies responsible for their role in enabling surveillance? And what are some of the challenges that you're facing around this?
You want to go ahead, Emma, or shall
I? I mean, I can chat and then hand it back to you. You know, I'll try to keep it brief because I think that there's so much to say on this. So I'm going to quickly talk about what my organization is doing because I think it might be useful for other folks working in this space. And then I'm going to rapid fire go through some ideas that I think that, you know, you can take back to your work tomorrow morning. So, you know, I work for a labor union. And for us, surveillance capitalism isn't something that's happening out there. It's actually something that is happening to our members. Our members are being surveilled at work across many sectors. And so this is a problem that we are, you know, not just dealing with in the kind of shareholder space, but it's something that we're thinking about in terms of how we protect our own members. And, you know, one thing that we've been part of is a project with a major Canadian university that is studying worker surveillance and figuring out how we build pattern language into collective agreements that protect workers at work. And I'm happy to share more information about that following this panel. And then, you know, as a responsible investor, we've had to build a framework to identify, measure, quantify, and remediate risk. We have built the cost of remediation into our investment management fee. And, you know, we fundamentally acknowledge that better managed companies and companies who manage their enterprise risks perform better as investments. And so, and our members have asked us to ensure that their money, their worker capital, is being ethically invested. And so it is my role every day to screen our portfolio and do the due diligence that is necessary to make sure that we are doing that. So for folks who are working in the investor space, you know, investors and ESG teams really need to step up on this. You need to ask whether or not you are enabling the harms of surveillance capitalism anywhere in your portfolio. You know, there's amazing literature out there from Simone Brown to Shoshana Zuboff, organizations like Mahente, Ranking Digital Rights, and others, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. Read up on what they're doing, look at your portfolio, ask questions, figure out if you're asking the right questions. Think about workers, don't forget workers in all of this. Shareholder engagements are on the rise. If shareholder advocacy is something that you do, consider how you can bring these issues up with your portfolio companies. And also watch out for shareholder engagements that are coming up. I know, for example, that we're going to see some shareholder engagements on these issues in particular at Google, Facebook, Amazon, Thomson Reuters, Verizon, and probably some others. And I'll keep it very, very brief, but speak to your companies about adopting the UN guiding principles. You know, the UN GPs offer a really clear roadmap for how to make sure that you are managing the risks associated with the risks and harms of surveillance capitalism. Honestly, it's like a really clear roadmap. And so if you aren't familiar with those, I invite you to go check them out. And the final thing I'll say is that well, from an investor perspective, I'm keeping my eyes out on the European directive on mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence that is expected next year, Q2. And it, you know, I think that there's probably a lot of folks that are lobbying really hard to dilute it right now and make sure that what it could be doesn't come to pass. But what it could be is mandatory human rights due diligence reporting in every company that operates in Europe across every sector, across the entire supply chain, including technology. And what it means is I mean, is going to be a landslide shift potentially, and other jurisdictions are going to be figuring out how to keep up. And so, this is a call to investors that this is coming, and we need to be really thinking about, this space has gone unchecked for 2 decades, and so how are we in the next decade going to find a way to check this space? And I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And, I would add perhaps that a great first step is really for investors to understand better the range of threats that are within this space. I think that there's a tendency to focus on things that look really big and bad, right? Like facial recognition or face surveillance, which is justifiable, but it's also important to understand that a lot of these automated decision systems, right, these AI-based decision-making tools have been shown to incorporate significant inequity, right? They actually amplify social inequity and often incorporate, potentially unfixable bias, simply because of the sets of assumptions that are built into the tools. So I think it's important to ask those right questions, right? Not necessarily is this technology good or bad, but with what set of assumptions is this technology built, and how will implementation of this technology when it's out in the world impact those societal inequities. And also then expanding, your concept of the tools that feed data into these systems that can also in themselves be harmful, right? So we're in a space where we have smart vehicles, we have smart cities, we have smart wearables, right? We have smart homes. All of these are sources of data, and I think it's important for investors to ask the right questions about how that data is being protected, right? Is this simply a Wild West sort of gold rush where these companies are rushing in without regard to those existing ways in which those communities have expressed how they would like agency over their data. So, in terms of what the bigger picture is, in terms of what investors can do, I think shareholder activism is certainly a great thing because it, at the very least, raises the profile of these issues and makes clear that companies need to at least care about the optics, right, of trying to deal with these issues. Better than dealing with the optics would be actually creating mechanisms of outside accountability, right? So I think we've seen like mushrooms flowering in a field. We've seen like all of these ethics committees come up, but a lot of them have proven to be ineffective simply because I think they have the veneer of accountability without real accountability mechanisms. I think we've seen some good things come out of them, but a good recent example is Microsoft investing in AnyVision, a company that has some very questionable practices around facial recognition, and was apparently vetted through their internal Ether committee, which is their internal ethics structure. They eventually divested after a public outcry, but it sort of begs the question, right? If the process is entirely non-transparent and you're applying standards that you haven't told anyone, how much is it really worth in terms of outside accountability? So I think for investors, you have that ability to push beyond just the optics of ethics to meaningful community engagement and values that are driven by the people that are most impacted by these technologies. And that can get us, I think, to a better place. One last thing, we clearly need, I think, more regulation in this space simply because the Wild West has not been working. I think GDPR has taken good steps in that direction in Europe, the general data privacy regulation and the other standards that Emma mentioned as well. And I think, investors would be well served to support, clear and transparent rules of the road for this playing field so that we're not simply in a bottom line driven space, but we can actually have some room for human values as well.
Thank you both. So this is really helpful. I think you're both speaking to not only, we often talk about the need for more transparency and disclosure from companies, and also you're both speaking to some contradictions between what companies will tell investors and the public and legislators in, you know, congressional hearings, and then what we're actually seeing through reporting and also by listening to groups and organizations who represent communities who are most directly impacted by the harm caused by these technologies. So Emma, you talked a little bit about, you know, working alongside the members and the workers, and your role as an investor in really doing that due diligence to understand and ask questions that may get underneath and expose some of those contradictions, including in engagements with companies. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about what it looks like for you as an investor to work in partnership with and in solidarity with frontline groups, and how you think about accountability in your work.
Yes, that's a great question. Thanks. You know, I think that the best way to explain this is in a real life example of a shareholder engagement that we filed this past year. Sorry, I've got a bit of an echo on my voice. And so we, you know, as part of our due diligence, we are ensuring that we are, you know, managing risk in our portfolio, and we definitely would not have seen this risk that came up in our portfolio if not for a news article that I actually was sent. I was sent a news article about technology that was being used by that was developed by Thomson Reuters, that worked, you know, hand in glove with Palantir's technology, and in over numerous contracts worth millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, the technology was being used by ICE to track, detain, and deport migrants on a massive scale. And, you know, this stuff wasn't showing up in the analyst reports. And so we actually, you know, reached out to ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and we said, who do we need to be talking to about this? And we were connected with a whole bunch of groups, and namely Mahente, which is a Latinx organization that has been trailblazing work on holding the tech companies accountable that have been enabling the Trump administration's deportation agenda. And, you know, from there we were connected to, you know, law professors at CUNY, law professors at Johns Hopkins, folks in different parts of the world. And, you know, first and foremost, we got to hear not from an analyst report, not from a news report, not third hand, but I got to hear directly from folks how these technologies were causing harm. And I think that there's often this really big divide between the investment community and frontline communities, and also companies and frontline communities. And so this, I think this enabled us to really ground the shareholder proposal in experience, in reality. And I think it made the shareholder proposal honestly stronger. And it made us know that, you know, we weren't just fighting for something abstract, we were fighting for something really, really meaningful and really, I mean, life or death. And so, you know, as a labor union, we're used to building relationships with other stakeholders, and it might not be something that other investors are used to doing. But I think that for those who are concerned about surveillance capitalism and really want to hear what's happening right from those communities, I would really, you know, invite you to do that, and you know, and also like invite you to do that in a non-transactional, like not to do it in a transactional kind of way, but to you know, build you know, strong, deep relationships there.
Thank you. So we only have just a few minutes left. Shankar, I'd love to hear from you if there's anything that you haven't shared yet that you think it's important for investors to know as they do the work that Emma described and that folks on this call are, you know, probably already engaged in. As they engage companies, what would that be? And then if there's anything that you want to share with folks about how they can support the work that you're leading at Mira, we would love to hear about that as well.
I think that's a great segue, actually. So my organization, which is just getting off the ground, is called Mira, which stands for Mobilize, Innovation, Reimagine Agency. And it really is meant to begin the work to address this gap where I think communities that are most impacted tend to lack agency and fluency and not even be at the table in the conversations around that, these critical conversations we have around tech where, you're determining what tech to build to solve what problem, for whom and with what impact. And it's not surprising, I think, that so many of the products coming out of the tech sector are so skewed in answering those questions because the right people really weren't around the table. So, we aim to build that capacity through these repeated engagements, right, where we are not only hoping to be able to build the bridges for communities to effectively engage with the companies that build technology and to have a seat at the table, but also to very, I think, consciously view that as an exercise in transferring resources so that, we actually think that it's worthwhile for the tech companies to fund this capacity building and this engagement because, frankly, the communities that are most impacted by technology are being pulled in so many directions, particularly this year with movements around race and with the pandemic, that they need that funding, which is very present in the tech sector. So our website is mirathefuture.org, and you can also just reach out to me via that website or shankar@mirathefuture.org. We're looking to take on, I think, pilot projects that reflect the previous work that I and others have been doing in this space where we've directly engaged with companies like Microsoft, like Amazon, but also, much smaller companies where, our experience has been people in these sectors, many of them don't want to create technology that harms communities, right? And I think for outside investors, your role can be to boost those voices, right, by giving them some outside pushing, right, that amplifies the voices and gives them a little more power, right? This is a struggle that's going on within these large companies. We're trying to get communities in the door. And from the outside, I think amplifying the need to get communities, why it's critical that tech get it right this time, can be a really strong complement to that work.
Great, thank you. Emma, how about you? Is there anything else that you want to share about how folks can support the work that you're doing, including the shareholder resolutions that you've been organizing?
Yeah, I think we're really low on time, but I'll just say, if you haven't already, go back to your workplace and read up on surveillance capitalism. Figure out what questions you're not yet asking and figure out what it looks like for you to build a framework. Get involved with organizations like the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. Take a look at what grassroots groups are doing. Support shareholder resolutions that you're seeing. We're going to be filing at Thomson Reuters as one, and I mentioned a few others that are going to be filed. And look high and low, look beyond the tech sector in your portfolio, because as we said, this isn't just in the tech sector. This is across the entire economy, and I think we're in a critical moment where we have to decide what kind of a future we want, and the stakes are very high. And in this moment, the investment community can be big allies in this work, and can play an important role. And I think they can and they must.
Great. Well, thank you both for this very quick, short, and sweet and rich discussion. I really appreciate you both joining, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us virtually today. I am going to put my email in the chat, and it sounds like folks can please reach out to Shankar and Emma if you are interested in getting involved, want some more resources on this topic, or want to learn about efforts to make sure that companies are not rooting their business model in surveillance. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.